All right, we are going live, folks, and we are live. Welcome everyone to the State for School Construction Working Group on this day, October 22nd, 2024. We're going to kick things off this morning with a presentation from the AOE. Joe Briggs Campbell and Bob Donahue will be presenting to us, and we will be having a discussion around a draft school construction aid proposal. And we thank them for the work that they've done. This is super helpful, and I think it will encourage some great discussions today. So with that, if there are no questions or comments at this point, we will go ahead and allow you to start, knowing that Nicole Lee, who is on the agenda, will not be here today. So we have amended the agenda to remove Nicole Lee from this 9:30 presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good to see everybody in person. And Bob Donahue made the trip over the hill to join us in person today. And so, I know, right? So here is how I was thinking we could work our way through this. So this is really a proposed framework. It really is an outgrowth of the task force work from last year, but we've refined some things, I think, to better reflect sort of where we are with the education system today. It's been a lively year. And so what I was thinking we could do is sort of look through the slide deck, which is a very general kind of approach, and then sort of get like the whole flow of what we're sort of looking at, and then maybe dive into the details, really working through each section and having a conversation around each. So I'm thinking of something as a very high level, brief presentation, and then really more of a conversation and a discussion as we dive in. Because this is really, I think, in a lot of ways, the meat of what we really want to be talking about in terms of what are the ways that we're going to be approaching this program with an understanding that we're never going to have all the money that we would essentially like to have, but also that there is a lot of work happening at the education systems level, and we want to try to bring some alignment between those bigger conversations and this program, because this program could really be a driver of some of the priorities that we're looking at. So that's our approach. Does that make sense for folks? Is that another?
That sounds like a very good idea.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So you've got the printed out slide deck in front of you. I don't know if you can share it on screen for the folks at home. And we'll just kind of start working through. So again, this is very high level, and then the more of the bones of it are in the document that you have. So proposed framework for school construction. I think you all have heard me mention this before. I think of this the way I think of any of our funding programs. There are eligibility criteria, what gets you through the door in the first place. There is assurances that are attached to the funds on the back end, right? And you need to be very clear about those things. So this gets you in the door, but these are the things that you are agreeing to if you are taking state dollars. And then in the middle is sort of how do we prioritize what kinds of projects we might review, approve, and fund. And then this question around bonus incentives or bonus share. So this idea that, and we'll talk more about this, like if you had a base, for example, in the previous program, it was 30%. Rhode Island has a base that's actually framed around community poverty. So their base share actually grows from like 20% all the way up to 90%. And then in addition to that, you can add on if your project is directed towards certain state identified priorities, the state will pay a bigger share of your bond payment, right? So that sort of approach in terms of bonus incentives. And then just some additional considerations for us to discuss. I bet there's 1,001 more questions, but just to give us something to sort of start to talk about. If you look on slide 3 of your slide deck,
Oh, who would have submitted that?
I think Annie sent it over to Megan. Yeah.
I need to send it to me, so
And while we're sorting this out, can I just say a few quick things? I just want to sort of set the table a little bit in terms of what this presentation is as opposed to the draft that we saw last time from that Beth St. James wrote up for us.
Absolutely.
We're really talking about, there's a governance sort of piece of work that we're doing, and then this, which is more of a framework of what the program will look like. And so those are the two things we're working on right now. We're not really talking about where the money's going to come from and how much money there's going to be. We're talking governance and framework. So those are the two things that we're focused on.
Absolutely. And I would not say that what this represents is anything like draft legislation. This is more like what kind of program do we want to run? And then how that translates into legislation is a problem for Beth. She looked up, hey, wait a minute. All right. Okay, so if we go to the program application cycle, which is slide 3 in your slide deck, this is really just giving sort of a sense of very, very high level, way more detail as you actually develop a program, but how this would work. So the first is step 1 would be a supervisory unit, or maybe multiple supervisory units or districts, meeting all eligibility requirements, and we'll talk more about those. They are then able to submit a completed application to the State Aid for Construction Program for consideration. We may actually have sort of a 2-step process. This actually is how the Rhode Island program ran, and then also how our previous program ran, which is there's kind of an initial pass, and then they go and do a lot more of the work and you know, the architectural drawings and passing a bond and all of that work, and then that's the sort of final approval on the back end. Step 2 is that the construction program team, wherever that may lie, will review each project and assign prioritization points and assess which bonus incentives might apply, if that's the structure that we went with. Step 3 would be the construction program team will submit recommendations for approved projects to an advisory council or some other oversight body. In the previous Vermont program, that was the State Board of Education. We talked about in our last meeting that that might be a separate oversight entity called the School Construction Aid Advisory Council or some such. Step 4 would be the oversight body will consider the appropriate amount of aid for the qualifying projects based on available monies. So that's when we get into annual funding cycles. And then step 5, the SU/SD subrecipient must meet all assurances for the length of the bond following the completion of the construction project. So there's a whole assurances section. And we can talk about for each of those moments, and you'll see in bold, right? These are kind of all the things we need to talk about. What level of control, what level of driving towards specific goals we want each of those things to accomplish. So really, how strong do we want to be in terms of the eligibility criteria? How strong do we want our assurances to be so that we are seeing specific behaviors once we attach dollars to a school? So these are all things for us to talk about. I would say that the agency's approach in this proposal is a little bit stronger or more refined than the task force proposal. It looks similar, but some of the details are a little bit stronger, and that is reflective, I think, of just where we are with the education system at this point. This is all really open for discussion, right? So very much, open to feedback and input around how this might work. Just giving us something to start from. All right, so if we go to slide 4, looking at eligibility criteria, the things that we called out were really geared towards what do we want to have a basic standard for the quality of the facilities work to begin with. And we didn't go very far afield here. We basically looked at what's already required in statute in Act 72 and through the district quality standards. So really like basic levels of kind of facilities proficiency is what we were aiming for. And we can talk more about each of these things. And Bob can absolutely, he's swimming in these waters every day and can really explain what these things look like when they're proficient. So a level of proficiency on the facilities management section of the district quality standards, which includes the development of a capital plan, operations maintenance manual, and a designated person with responsibility for facilities management with necessary qualifications. So that was one area where we said, if we're going to be investing state dollars in a district, we want to know that they have basic levels of proficiency in managing their existing facilities, so we have confidence of good stewardship of those dollars moving forward. We also discussed as eligibility criteria, the completion of a district, an SU level facilities master plan that engages in robust community involvement and is considerate of regional solutions, meeting the minimum criteria defined by the state in the grant program that was created last year for facilities master planning grant, but doesn't have any funding for it yet. But we did outline what those sort of minimum qualifications would be in that grant. And so the reasoning there is that we want them to look at their entire portfolio of buildings, have a plan for all of those buildings in an SU or SD before they decide to invest in a specific building. And if they can look across the SUSD boundaries and look at their neighbors, all the better, right? And so one of the things that we do need to future state talk about in this group is what are the barriers that may exist in statute or rule that prevent that kind of collaborative work. And are there changes that need to be made, or are there tools that are being underutilized maybe right now? It's a research project, I think, for all of us. And then also the second part is that we wanted to ensure that any project that's being put forward has had really strong community engagement to increase the likelihood of a bond passage, right? And so we know that doing that pre-work and that community engagement, really having a vision for the facility is really critical to being able to pass a bond. And then we did signal that an evaluation of environmental contaminants should be considered and pursued as part of this master planning process. Environmental contaminants, I know we automatically think PCBs, but we should also be thinking mold. We should be thinking lead. We should be thinking both paint and in the water. We should be thinking asbestos. So really having a clear understanding of what might be there when you rip open a wall, which tends to drive up costs, should be part of this planning process.
Can we pause, Jill, for 1 second? Is that okay?
Yeah.
I just want to see if anyone had any questions at this point, because this is a lot already, and
Yeah, and I think we'll dive in more here as well.
So I have an interpretation of facility management, and I have an interpretation of facility master plan. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. We're actually talking about the actual structure of the buildings, talking about the bricks and mortar, talking about the roofing, talking about the HVAC systems, talking about plumbing. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about the operations and the delivery of services within that facility, correct?
Yeah, Bob, why don't you speak to this? I would say, I think there's different,
I
there's
guess,
different
why I asked
levels,
the
but
question.
I think we're actually looking for something a little bit more comprehensive.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. But again, it's all a matter of opinion and a matter of resource limitations that drive what you ultimately settle for, not necessarily what you would choose if you had abundant resources, right? So I'm not sure I completely understand just saying it's the building itself physically, right? Because you need a qualified and sustainable over time working group that can keep pace with technology to maintain that building, right?
It's a
So-
maintenance of the building.
Of the building, right,
Mhm.
yeah. But I mean, I guess I was hearing you're just maybe limiting to the physical infrastructure, but really it's the support staff is what is required and the qualifications of the
But
support.
the dollars, will the dollars go to the support staff? Or is the dollars going to go directly to the construction of that building? That's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
Anything from the construction aid program will go towards whatever the master planning and ultimate architectural engineering design is for the school. But the school has to budget appropriately to have the support staff.
But I think
support that
also-
vision.
That's just what I want to clarify for the dollars.
Yeah.
Where they're headed.
Right.
Is what I want to clarify. Because what's been lacking, they haven't done their capital infrastructure master planning, and they don't have documentation and current maintenance right now in terms of keeping up with the needs of the structure of the facility.
So that's what we're calling out in bullet 1 Act 72 has created new statutory requirements that did not exist 20 years ago. They were created in 2021. So.
Speak up when that.
Yeah, talk about giant lawnmower. So what we're saying, what we are positioning here is that eligibility criteria would require that they already have in place a 5-year capital improvement plan, qualified personnel that meets the minimum training and certification requirements, and a maintenance, an operations and maintenance manual that is tied back to their 5-year capital plan. But I did also want to make sure that we're also being clear about what's meant by the facilities master plan is not just the ongoing operational needs and like deferred maintenance needs and that sort of thing in the building. It should also include enrollment projections, ed specifications, a description of educational programming, so that that would be part of that facilities master plan. And any high quality facilities master plan that's being produced right now includes that, right? So any of our consultants that are working out in the field do that work already. So it's more than just the building and its condition. It's how is the building used, what's the enrollment projections, et cetera, et cetera.
Universal design, safety, all. of
Exactly, all those good things, yeah.
Senator Weeks had a question as well.
Just a curiosity, do we have a sense now of how many SDs have facilities master plans, facilities management sections, maintenance manuals, that kind of thing?
No,
And again,
I don't personally,
Okay.
we haven't collected that data as of
does
yet.
the agency have a template for these? You know,
Yeah,
as guidance?
that's
What
what
we've been
this
working
man-
on. Working on, yeah. So the goal is that any eligibility criteria, we would at least have some sort of template that could help a school district leapfrog from having nothing to at least the minimum required to get in the door. There's quite a few that already have probably surpassed what the minimum template is the requirement because they've already discovered the merits of it.
Is it intended by the agency at some point to have an idea of who's got it, who doesn't?
That's what the district quality standards are meant to do. And those go into effect in July of 2025.
Okay.
And so annually, they will be submitting kind of their self-evaluation documentation that demonstrates proficiency, and that, so it wouldn't be a separate data collection. It would be like, we would look at their district quality standards every year, and we would be able to identify, are they proficient? Are they meeting statute? Are they advanced proficiency? Even better. And that would be how we would generate the understanding of this.
You said June 2025?
July 1, 2025.
July.
But I think Bob's point is really critical. Is that part of DQS and Act 72 is that the agency is providing the tools to the districts so that everyone can meet that basic standard of proficiency. So everyone's on a level playing field. And then we do have some high flyers as well that have been able to do this work. So we also do know, and I don't know the exact count, but we do know that there are districts engaging in bringing on a consultant to do facilities master planning in a really in-depth way. And so those folks are already going to be, potentially in the pipeline with projects, right? And the master planning grant was another attempt to level the playing field because there is a cost to that. And so the idea is that if we got folks into that pipeline for facilities master planning, we're starting to build a whole portfolio of projects that would be ready to roll if and when funding became available. Yeah, so really trying to set up a pipeline. Okay. All right, I'm going to move on from eligibility criteria, but I do think the intention is to come back around and look at those details a little bit more and have folks sort of respond. Okay. So if we look at the next slide, which is looking at assurances. So eligibility gets you in through the door, and the assurances are sort of the strings attached on the back end. And this is, again, I'm going to signal that we took maybe a stronger approach than what was in the task force, again, sort of reflecting where we're at. So maintaining that qualified facilities leadership, again, just calling out what's in statute, so ensuring that you always have someone on the team who has met kind of the minimum qualifications, training, certification. a strategic 5-year capital plan that aligns with their facilities master plan, again, as required in Act 72. Here's a new one. Appropriate facilities budgeting, meeting national best practices, which is 3% for operations and maintenance. And we'll talk a little bit more about, we've proposed a fairly strong approach to what happens if they're not meeting, using Rhode Island as a model. So we can talk about that in a moment. A strong preventative maintenance plan.
Before we move on.
Yep.
So O&M, it's like two completely different worlds of operations and maintenance.
Yeah.
So 3%, my experience, that's a low number. If you're considering operations and maintenance, what are you really targeting, operations or maintenance?
I think both, right? The ongoing everyday custodial work, which is typically the operations. Yeah, there's a base level of that we want to have. I can speak from experience when budgets were tight, there's certain levels of cleanliness that you have, right? And the custodial world, you may have levels 1, 2, 3, 4, right? If you have all the budgeting you need, you might shoot for the level 4 where you're touching everything every day. When you have to have either budget restrictions or personnel restrictions, now you say, okay, what can we give up? Maybe we don't have the trash baskets every day. Maybe we do it every 4th day. Maybe we ask teachers to clean the dry erase board or the chalkboard off, right? And so you start looking at other ways of getting work done, but not the same volume or the same quality.
And
And those,
we have some data on this. So the 3%, it's 1% for operations and 2% for maintenance. That's sort of a national standard from the National Council of School Facilities.
but as always, there's always more to the story, right? So this is just a generic standard for schools or any buildings, not schools, any buildings that may have deferred maintenance for many years. The amount of catch up you have to do is more. So if they say that you haven't invested in your capital, if you haven't had a capital improvement plan that's strategically looking forward and addressing issues before they become critical, you then have to throw in more towards a maintenance budget to play catch up from all the deferred maintenance that you did, right? So these are just benchmarks. They're always negotiable, and it's just something like this requirement, at least to guarantee a certain minimum amount being spent.
Because what we have in our national data, when we're comparing ourselves, is that Vermont is typically around like, what, a 1.7 for their M&O. It was well below the national average,
Well,
right?
that's clear.
Yeah, and so what we're sort of saying is that, and again, folks can choose, folks have choices, right? That if we're going to attach state dollars, that we are then tying to it a commitment from that community, right? Because of course, the budget is passed by the community, that they will continue to invest an adequate baseline amount to maintain that building moving forward, that we've attached state interest to.
Where are you going in terms of it's low from your experience? Because maybe perhaps you're integrating it into a capital improvement plan, right? So and this is where it all becomes like an accounting decision too. What $5,000, maybe above that might be considered a capital expenditure. But some maintenance organizations absorb more than $5,000 in their maintenance expense budget for items that don't extend, say, the useful life of the larger building itself, right? So if someone is doing a capital improvement plan, coincident with having a strong maintenance operation, then your maintenance budget isn't necessarily always having to deal with the emergencies of failed capital plan. And so I'm not sure what your history is speaking to in terms of even the 3% being low, but perhaps it has something to do with no capital investment also. So maintenance drives high. So the more we become like an emergency firefighter squad, which most maintenance organizations are, because no one ever wants to invest in really sound stewardship, because it's seen as a cost, not as an investment. So typically the maintenance budget gets cut, capital improvement doesn't happen, and now you're always in firefighter mode. And then when we say, geez, the result of all of this is what we're kind of observing now in Vermont, and most places do this, right? Everybody talks the theoretical, hardly anyone achieves it in my experience. It's always playing catch up. And at some point, there's just too much to catch up. And then the FCI index of the building continues to climb. And then finally, I would say, at what point was that beyond reasonable to invest in repairs, or do we just raise the building and start fresh?
Maybe that, Senator Reese, you have.
Yeah, just another comment. So first, I fully understand the need to set this kind of requirement, and I fully agree with it. It's just, I feel in this committee, we've got to set some expectations, and I just want to make sure we're actually, since we're creating some targets, theoretically creating targets for the legislature to consider, that we're just setting the right expectation, that's all. So I would ask that if there is a data set, share it, just so we don't
And that data
miss
set
the
being
mark.
where we are currently from a percentage of O and M.
Okay,
Is that what you're asking? In other words, find out what on average school districts in Vermont are putting towards O and M.
yeah, and possibly other states, other
Oh, yeah.
experiences, you know,
Yeah.
something, you know, apples to apples,
Yes.
so we know we're hitting the right,
Yeah.
setting the right
21st
expectation.
century schools that does like the state of the schools report. And you take all of the, like, since there's a form that every school supplies to, the DOE. They grab that, cost center, it's 2,600. And all of those, they roll up all of the costs for operations and maintenance. So on a gross level, we can get that rather quickly. They already have that at 21st century schools. The problem becomes, as always, whenever you start to aggregate all this data, not everybody is necessarily reporting in the same cost bucket. So you have a number, but who knows how granularly accurate it is. But it gives us a relative indication, state by state, and then within school. We've already solicited, well, through the stat book, data update from our school districts, where Andy and I are starting to dig into what are the O&M budgets for schools.
Let's take one last quick question from Rep. Taylor.
I totally agree with your line of thinking, but I also want to add in there, not knowing where our education funding model is going to go. Got to be very careful right now if we stay with the same kind of formula, the capacity of the towns to actually hit the marks that we're setting for them. So I think a 3%, depending, is a good benchmark. And if, obviously, if towns can afford more, they can have a higher percentage, but I just, setting the bar too high could set up a failure as well.
I would also, I think that Bob would also want me to point out that, you know, the 3% O&M is a bit of a concession to that, but there is also a real and present issue of exactly the dynamic that Bob was describing, where you have your 3% O&M, but you should also have your 5-year investment plan. And those two things should constantly be talking to each other. Because the result of what we've seen is that a lack of investment in capital has then, you know, spilled over into emergency maintenance. And so having this kind of framework, you don't want to do one of these and not the others in terms of the assurances. You need a framework that's really hooked up together. And if you just do one, then what will slip is the 5-year capital plan, right? Because they won't have enough money. So it is a demand in our current education funding system. It is a demand on school communities. And we have to, as you were pointing out, we have to sort of determine if that's the expectation that's being set, if state dollars are being attached, right? Folks have the option to not attach state dollars, right? Yeah, I like to say adults making adult decisions can decide to do something we don't want them to do, but we wouldn't necessarily attach a state dollar to it. Yeah.
So just one last thing. In other words, we had a school write to me this week asking, are there any grants for emergency monies for safety systems? So, you know, we had to dig further into that. What do you call safety? Is it school safety in terms of active shooter threats or any kind of physical harm? No, it was an obsolete fire alarm system that has been continuously sending false fire alarms to the local fire department, right? So this is kind of what we talked about in our task force. In other words, some of these systems, in terms of the total cost value for the building, is small, but the ramifications of them not working become huge, right? So we have many obsolete legacy type fire alarm systems throughout the state, and there are no spare parts for them. And the only spare parts you can find are reconditioned ones or some from somebody you know who has a similar system that they just replaced. So these legacy systems, for them to change out this fire alarm system is $500,000. You just don't change out. Just think of it this way. The main fire alarm panel is kind of, think of it, your electrical panel in your house. when you have to change out a whole panel, they then require you to do a whole life safety review of the building. The code is changed. So now perhaps where you had certain pull stations, you need to have more pull stations. You may have to have more smoke detectors or heat detectors. All of this adds up to more than just changing out a panel for $40,000. And now we're talking $500,000. And it's just to fix an obsolete fire alarm panel. It does nothing to improve the rest of the efficiencies in the building. And when you start taking these subsystems and the dollar values they grow to, it quickly says, is it a wise investment? Even though required, is it a wise investment? But when we let things get to this critical emergency failure state, you have to keep it safe for the occupants. So you invest money where if you had more judicious review of how you choose to spend money, we may not have even invested in this building because enrollment projections show a decline in enrollment, whatever the other reasons might be. So these are all so integrated into the final decision making that goes into what we're talking about. And so much is opinion rather than the right thing to do. And so much is limited by the resource at hand, I think.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And I just want to offer up to our experts over here on the side. If you want to chime in at any time, please feel free. Okay, just, give me a little tap
Is
or.
now okay?
Sure. Yes.
Bethany James, Office of Legislative Counsel. I feel like caution everyone throwing around state dollars. And I am gonna defer to my colleagues at JFO to give you a even greater caution.
Yeah, Julia Richter, JFO. I know the committee is aware because we spoke about this last time, and it's very important to keep in mind that Vermont has a different funding system than all other states, right? So district budgets are still state dollars. It's, so using the term state aid or state dollars, wherever it fits into the school district budget, as long as we maintain Vermont's education funding system, they're all state dollars. It's just how are they impacting tax rates? So I just need to wave my flag over here. State dollars, where if they are fitting in a district budget, if it's categorical aid, if it's coming from the education fund, if it's coming from the general fund, it's all state dollars. So that's just an important caveat that I think really needs to stay in the center of the conversation for my.
Julia, should we say state bond payment? I mean, we're talking about a very specific thing.
Or are we saying?
What term would you like to use?
Well, or are we saying that should be the 3% O&M should be a requirement for everybody, regardless of a project? If that's sort of the expectation of, the stewardship of our dollars, they're all collective.
I think what you all are talking about is some sort of, and I'm going to use very general terms here, grant, award. I don't want to say contribution. It's all state dollars, but you're talking about a school construction program. I'm just going to use the term award. I think that's what you're talking about, right? When we're talking about that 30% or 15% or whatever, and all of the assurances that are needed to get that, the eligibility to get that. So I would suggest using, regardless of what you settle on, something like award or I don't know, some other better term. Because in this state, it's all gonna come, the money's coming from the state regardless.
And I think the point is that in our current system, where we do not have a state construction aid program, none of this attaches to what a district decides to do around construction.
Well,
We do have a program.
we do,
It's just not being
it's
used.
just not being used. I think that's
funded
important.
So functionally, none of our assurances, our eligibility, our oversight attaches right now. Because we do not have, the program has been suspended.
The
So,
money has been suspended. The program is still in place by statute, as well as rules or standards. Those have not been repealed. It's just the money has not followed through.
Is there is there any obligation for an SUSD to now seek pre-approval and final approval for something they're not getting an award for.
So they're not going through the program
Right.
because there's no dollars that fund it anymore, but the program has not been repealed. It's
Our
just
only-
not being used.
Our only hook was,
The
for the
dollars.
yield bill, was pre-approval for valid construction costs to be an exemption from excess spending calculation. When that's taken away, what is, I've had several emails already from superintendents saying, why would we bother going through pre-approval? Because now we have there's nothing to benefit us now. Excess spending, construction costs that were deemed valid through the pre-approval process, at least validated those construction costs so they could be qualified exemptions from the excess spending. Without that,
It's not leverage.
what's the effort? Why not go through it all?
So is there a through line that we need to connect here at 11 o'clock as well? I mean, in addition to like the going forward, but in the present moment
Mm.
and in the upcoming budget year. Because you're talking about exactly that excess spending.
We've sent out the memo that's encouraging everybody, continue going through the pre-approval, because if excess spending comes back, those exemptions, then at least now you're pre-approved. And they can go back to the taxpayer and say, okay, these will no longer be part of that education spending calculation. If that's what the decision is going forward. Right.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'm still a little, I think that's an important,
I don't wanna like completely steal my own thunder from 11 o'clock. But the exemptions do not get taken out of a district's education spending. They get taken out of how much you're calculating over a certain threshold that's double taxed. And that's very important because I think there is a misunderstanding there sometimes about the exemptions are being taken out of the bottom line, and that's not true. But I think what you all are doing is exactly what you need to be doing right now, and that is you have a program. I completely agree with Rep Emmons, you have a program in state law right now. Your job is to make pitches to your colleagues for whether or not you want to change it, right? And so everything that AOE is presenting right now, I would encourage you to think about in the context of what you already have on the books. Is it in line and you're just updating some numbers or some language? Is it completely different? Where did those changes get made? Do you like those changes? And what else do you need to change in your current program to bring it up to work for the changes you're discussing right now, right? Because not everything that you're discussing right now covers everything that's in statute or rule right now. So you're gonna wanna, if you all love this presentation and say, great, go draft that, I'm gonna come back to you and say, absolutely, how does this fit in? How does that fit in? How does that fit in? But I think you're starting that work, and I think that's where you all need to be going. So there is that tension, but I think that's exactly what you're supposed to be sorting out.
Thank you. And that was a great discussion. If I could, I want to echo what was said about this is all state dollars, but I believe the provenance of all this work is a bill that I put in 2 years ago around school construction that came from a very personal experience living in my town where we had to pass years ago a $39 million bond for deferred maintenance because our portfolio of schools had such dire needs that we needed to pass this significant $39 million bond, which we're still using to this day. We all know what happened after that. We had to build a new high school. That was a whole separate bond. But I guess my desire to start this work was just around the fact that it was hard to ask voters in our town to vote for these two bonds. You know, these were two separate bonds over many years. And what we heard on the ground is like, well, what is the state helping us out? What is the state doing to help us out? Because you do feel kind of isolated and alone when you're in these circumstances. And our answer was, well, nothing right now because of this moratorium, right? So I was really hoping that what we could come up with was some kind of program that would not pay for this work that needed to be done, but that would encourage local voters to support the work that needed to be done. So I just wanted to sort of set the table for that a little bit. That was where this all came from. And I know it all comes from state dollars, but there is the optic is different when it's like, these are my property taxes paying for our school budget, and this is aid coming from the state or whatever. So anyway, just wanted to say that. Thank you for listening, and we can move on.
Okay, we're going to move on to slide 6, which, if you're familiar with the existing program, this prioritization part will look very familiar, although we've made some changes to the prioritization. So if an SU or SD had met the eligibility criteria and was willing to follow the assurances, understanding the strings attached, and submitted a project for consideration, review, and approval, then this is the work that potentially a construction program team would be doing to review. So they would look at, and again, this is literally something to look at. So we might change, the points assigned based on what we felt was important to prioritize. So the things that we looked at were enrollment projections, community use, like can the building kind of do double duty, health and safety and building condition. We will talk about that. The AOE does feel, and I think Bob was pretty eloquent about this, that there are some buildings that reach a certain facilities condition index where maybe we just draw the line under them. And then also potentially prioritizing heavily consolidation or regional approaches. We could have 3 hours of conversation around how we prioritize. Are there things that are missing? And then that bottom is just years in process. So understanding that there will always be resource constraints in terms of the money available. If we can't fund a project 1 year, it comes back another year, it gets points every time for kind of the long-term wait. Yeah.
I have a question when I was looking at this. Overcrowding. I was surprised to see that there. Is that an issue? And do we think it will be an issue given that we do have declining enrollment?
Yes.
For decades.
It's not a common issue. But in the air, like the 1 or 2 districts where it is an issue, it's a significant issue. And so it is a question of, and I think that it's absolutely worth the conversation of, are you only prioritizing overcrowding because you're recognizing that is just a really urgent need. It actually impacts, fire safety code and all of those things. But do you also want to look at, there is declining enrollment. There is a need to consolidate these schools. The building was built for 400 kids, but it's currently serving 200, but you have, nurses in old closets, right? Or you have occupational therapists that are using a conference room that's also used by 5 other people. So that kind of educational capacity, I think, also goes into that. I think there's a lot to pull out there, but there are a few districts where overcrowding is an issue. And so in other states, that's a real and urgent need. But it is a real need where it's, yeah. But again, just something for us to look at. Thanks. I'm going to keep moving and we can kind of come back around to all of these. So prioritization considerations, the weighting assigned to priorities can be a means to steer projects towards alignment with a long-term vision for education in the state. And I want to distinguish here between prioritization, which would get you more points and move you kind of to the top of the list in terms of who's going to get an approved project and potential award money. Award money. There we go. I got a thumbs up. Versus a bonus incentive, which is really a different thing. So prioritization is really critical. It's which projects, what kinds of projects are we saying we really want to make sure get funded? And then the bonus incentive is really the state driving towards specific strategic projects that we want to see happen, right? So they interplay with each other, but they are different. So the years in process criteria makes sense, and that a school with a project in the queue but goes unfunded gets points in order to increase its ranking in subsequent years. And then Martine, exactly, should we think about how to handle schools that have declining enrollment, but maybe they have really substantial facilities needs? Do we consider a facilities condition index value threshold in conjunction with the declining enrollment projection as a priority for our project? So all things to discuss.
What's FCI?
FCI is the facilities condition index.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, and I do think it's important because sometimes we'll see something like a school has an FCI of 30 and we think, oh, it's not so bad, 30%, like that's not bad. What an FCI means, and our consultants explained this to me once, and I'm stealing from them. It's like an on-off switch on a system. So it's either a failed system, the fire alarm panel, or it is a system that is one failure point away from failing and there is no replacement for it. So if you actually have an FCI index of 30%, that means a third of your systems are either failed or 1 point away from failing. And so that's not great, actually. I think our highest FCI in the state was like 70%, right? But most of them are sitting in that spot of like the 30 to 50 or 60%. That means, you know, a third to half of their systems are either failed or about to fail. So that's actually not great. So 30% is no bueno. It would not be great in your car, right? So do we want to consider a specific FCI kind of value threshold in combination with maybe declining enrollments? How would we do that? Question to ask.
Excellent. And Senator Weeks, I
No, just out of curiosity, so going backward one slide to prioritization, are we going to sometime today begin to talk about why these factors are weighed as heavily or not as heavily?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If we have time, and maybe that'll be our next meeting as well. All right, so moving on to slide 8, bonus incentives. This, I'm going to say we absolutely borrowed the homework of Rhode Island, very, very thankfully. This is way that they have this set up, and I think it's an intriguing model for us to consider. The bonus incentives are basically on like a 5-year cycle, and I can't remember if it's their advisory council or which body it is, kind of reevaluates like every 5 years, right? Like these are the things that we really want to incentivize. These are the kinds of projects we really want to see happen. And then in 5 years, they start to signal we maybe be shifting our priorities, right? Maybe we did a bunch of projects that were in Rhode Island, they call it newer and fewer, right? Maybe we did a bunch of projects there. And now we're actually really starting to shift towards we want to expand buildings so that they can serve pre-K, because that's a really big priority. And we know that our public school buildings are not really set up to provide pre-K, you know, and maybe in the next 5 years. So this is a way, like the prioritization would stay steady, but the bonus incentives are a way to drive specific kind of actions that we want to see our schools taking. So I think this is an interesting model. I think that this unfortunately does come down to funding, right? So how in Rhode Island, they have a limit on how many of these you can stack, right? So you can't get, 80% just by stacking all your bonus incentives. What percent each of these gets assigned is a conversation. That's a budget starting expression of priorities, right? And so are these the right bonus incentives? These were the ones that the agency felt most in line with where we think we're heading in terms of our strategic plan, for our education system. I think we can have very interesting conversations around this and the prioritization criteria. If you look at the kind of more detailed sheet, we actually gave a description of what each of these things would look like. We did not assign percent priorities because, that would be really presumptuous of us. So looking at school safety and security, And you'll see that these all do kind of tie back to the prioritization. So there is nothing here that's like an outlier, right? There's nothing here that isn't also connected to prioritization. Replacement, meaning, what do we mean on that one, Bob? Help me out, I can't remember. Short-handed or anything. Safety, that was my
Seems
clarification.
duplicative.
Wouldn't it be, it's,
oh,
it's lived its useful life?
Yes, so it's a building that is above a certain FCI. And it's like, we're not going to invest, but they are looking at doing
But it
a replacement of that
Seems
building.
duplicative of the second to last and the last bullets.
It could be, they might not be consolidating. Major renovation would be the existing building stays in place, but they are doing a major renovation of like the envelope of the building, or the interior of the building, to improve educational alignment and capacity. So again, that would be the example of a community school might be a major renovation. You need to add a health clinic, you need to add more, food service areas, whatever that may be. It could be adding on a pre-K, right? That would be a major renovation, but it wouldn't be a replacement of the building. You could do something if you had, say, a building that was, 60% FCI, so we're not going to invest in that building. You might be consolidating with another, say, local elementary school, or you might just be replacing that building.
Yeah, but consolidation's not on here.
Newer and fewer, consolidation.
Good.
Yeah. And we can dig into these a bit more, but we do have kind of full descriptions of them. And I think there may be others that we didn't highlight here, but is worth considering. Environmental performance and sustainability, I do want to call out, we did only in combination with another bonus. And that was a specific choice that we made. The reasoning here is that while improving environmental performance is an important goal, it really, given our limited resources, given our need to drive towards certain educational goals, we would want to see those projects happening in combination with projects that would improve the educational experience of students. So there might be long-term cost savings to improving environmental performance, but those are not projects that we would approve in and of themselves. So that's something I want to call out. And that is a difference with the previous program where, projects like the biofuel projects were standalone projects. We're sort of making a policy proposal here that if you're not including improving the educational experience of students, that it's not a project that we would incentivize. That's a worth discussion.
I do think it's great that you did that. I also think it's unfortunate that we can't somehow quantify the energy expenditures that we have in our goals, because I can tell you they are outrageous, and updating those, which is often in conjunction with environmental performances. It's a cost savings over time, huge cost savings.
It is. Yeah, and we do have some quantification of that through the facilities assessment. It included a level 2 audit. I don't disagree with you. In my opinion on this, because we did have conversation about this internally as well, is that I guess sort of two things. If we had a clear understanding of other potential sources of funds that could be brought to bear, then that might be the way to go. And I think that there are. So there is the option to sort of raise funds. But for our team, and this did change. I'll say this is actually a place that changed from the task force. And it was, for me, it was changed very much in reflection of where we're at with our education system. And the real fiscal constraints that we're going to be up against. So it felt like the right choice for us, but I think it's absolutely a conversation that, we should continue to have. And it doesn't mean that folks couldn't do it, right? And that they couldn't do things like performance contracting, which, has good benefits over time, but not as a standalone, right? Was our pitch here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that was, it was high level, but we dove in. if we sort of look at I don't know how you want to tackle this, Erin and my team. And we have half an hour.
Right,
Do we
so
want to just tackle one section?
that's what, I mean, I think this documents are really helpful, the way that everything is sort of grouped. It seems like the eligibility and assurance still separate are sort of one,
Yeah,
possibly slightly easier.
all right.
And then the prioritization and the bonus incentives are, though separate, also more tied together,
Yeah,
probably more important and more challenging. I actually almost wonder if we start with the more, given our higher cognitive power earlier in the morning, do we start with the second, the harder, the prioritization and the bonus stuff?
I think it's more fun, frankly.
I mean, that's really the meat of what we're here to
I
do,
mean,
right?
eligibility and assurance is not always the most exciting thing to talk about.
I think I would rather see us have more time for the harder decisions, and so forcing ourselves to start there.
On bonus incentives.
On prioritization and bonus incentives, I think sort of that side of the program.
And one thing I do want to point out.
Yeah.
Another sort of thing that we need to discuss as we're discussing prioritization and bonus incentives is, are we setting a base amount that we're then stacking onto? So that is also a point of conversation. So I think that
Base amount.
so I think what we had put forth was the idea that like all districts would have a 20% base amount. We could also include community need to increase that base amount. Rhode Island absolutely bases it on community need as well. We put FRL in there, and I just want to call out that I'm very skeptical of FRL as a measure of community poverty or need. I think we have other measures. It's like a shorthand for community need. So could we have a system where all districts would have a minimum of 20%? And then based on community need, it might increase up to a base of 30%. And then you stack on the bonus incentives. That is a
So
question.
those are your priority points you're talking about.
No, not even the priority points is how are we evaluating the project and what number of points is it going to get that will then determine, like a list will be handed to an advisory council with projects ranked. You know, Happy Valley Elementary got 99 points, Woodford, whatever, got 75 points. And that's an objective ranking system that has nothing to do with any subjective determination.
All right, I'm gonna repeat back and check my understanding. So prioritization in this contract is not any actual money. We're not talking 30% for consolidation. We're talking about the process of reviewing projects.
Yeah.
And then all these ranked projects go to the advisory committee. The bonus incentives are where we get into the amount of financial, whatever we're calling it.
No, I thought it'd be like,
Award.
you have a,
Is our concept there, are we all on the same page about
And
that?
everybody would start from a baseline. So if you're on that ranked list that gets handed to the advisory council, everybody that got approved that year would get a minimum of 20%.
why?
20,
So what's the purpose
20% of what?
What's the purpose of all this, of just starting, everybody's at 20% as opposed to everybody's at 0? And then they begin to prioritize and then potentially add bonuses. Why, what does 20% have to do with anything?
Well, this is exactly how the previous program ran, right? Everybody received 30%, right?
That's your award.
That's your
All the
award.
awards.
So that's on the
Eligible
bonus
cost.
side, that's
Of
your money, your
eligible,
award.
of
So-
eligible construction. It's
Yes.
not 30% of the total amount of construction. It is what is eligible.
So what we are saying is, do we start with a framework of every project that made it through to the advisory council, the list of approved projects would start with a 20% award of eligible construction costs. And then you stack on the bonus, a 5%, an additional 5%, an additional 2%, if the project is geared towards those priorities that we need to see. So can I give a real world example?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's say we had a project come forward I'll make a really simple one. That was a consolidation. So it was, there was 3 elementary schools within a district. They want to close 2 of those and do a major renovation on their 3rd one. So walking in the door, they met the eligibility criteria. They were meeting the consolidation, so they got 30 points. Also, the existing building was in pretty rough shape. So they got, 35 points when it came to health, safety, and building condition. Enrollment projections, they had seen a downward, maybe we include declining enrollment. And so they were also doing good work there in that they were acknowledging their declining enrollment. They're going to have a more efficient system. So they got 25 points, and it was going to be a community school. So this is a good project from the terms of the prioritization. So this community is a fairly affluent community. Their project got 95 out of 100 points. So going to the advisory council, they would start with a 20% award of eligible construction costs. That's what they would start. But then if we look at the bonus incentives, they would be racking up additional percentage. And we could put a cap on it because they are doing newer and fewer. They are adding educational programming. Maybe they have energy. Maybe it's going to be super energy efficient and meet is it CHIP? The CHIP, look at me, Bob.
Yeah.
The CHIP standard. So they're actually adding on an additional 12%. So now we're looking at a 32% award on eligible costs.
And how do you determine what is eligible cost?
Well, that's where the construction guide comes in and the review and approval. So we're not talking about that in
Because
this.
even though you're adding the bonuses, is it a certain percent of each one of those bonuses that would be eligible? So if you're putting in a whole new HVAC system that's energy efficient, are you just getting that percentage for the energy efficiency system? Or you're getting it for the whole construction project of everything?
I think Rhode Island's doing it, it's a percentage of the gross award going.
The whole award.
Prior to the bonus addition, yeah. But again, you bring up a good point. Everybody has, in the old system, if the school district submitted a project for approval and they had their architects and engineers go out for the pre-bidding and they came out to 100 million. Through the application process for pre-approval, we would be limiting the amount of square footage that would be considered by grade level, by enrollment.
Right.
So we may come up with this maximum cost for state participation value of 80 million. So they know their real costs are 100 million. We came up with a calculation called the MCSP and it comes in at 80 million. The award was 30% of the 80 million, not 30% of their actual bids, right?
Yeah.
So they would only have ended up getting 24 million award.
Yeah, this all assumes we still have a review process that is robust.
Right.
We require ed specifications. We require all of the existing things I would say that exist in the construction guide of the original program would in large part still be in effect. There's still a review process here that would make a determination of eligible construction.
I have 2 really contradictory thoughts running through my head right now. One is that given the incredible amount of deferred maintenance and all the work that we've done around the inventory and where we know things are, it seems fully appropriate to be moving towards a model where there's some sort of base amount. Even if you don't end up getting a bunch of bonus things, there's just a lot of need out there. So it's reasonable on its face to say that whatever the amount is, I'm not sure it's going to be 20 or 30, but that there's some state share base amount getting kicked in. On the other hand, I'm looking at it in the world of the ed fund property tax challenges we are having, the systemic challenges we're having, the conversations the commission's having, that Listen and Learn is having, saying we're going from 0 right now of actual state aid dollars to something, maybe hopefully in the next couple of years. Those need to be, the need is so big and we can't meet it. So those need to be super targeted and super successful in terms of the kind of future path we're on. And so maybe we're not in a place right now where there's any base amount. It's really just about, at least for the first 3 years, 5 years, it's just about some really strategic, maybe they're not bonus, they're just the strategic incentives that you have to be meeting. So, but those are two very different, and again, they fall under the umbrella of, you know, how much money. And there is none, there won't be enough, whatever it is, but those are two different like financial paths.
Zero.
Financial paths, and I can see a strong argument for both, so I'm a little stuck, so Senator Weeks help.
Just a question.
Yeah.
Maybe a comment. Strategic, you use the word strategic.
Incentives
Incentive.
instead of bonus incentives?
No. So the strategy has to dovetail to the prioritization. I mean, we can't do it any other way. That if we're really trying, if we have a
Right.
limited amount of money.
Right.
That's going to trickle out and hopefully over time become more robust.
Yeah.
That our strategy's got to match our prioritization right up front, not as a kind of a collateral, subset that we're bumping into. The two are intimately linked.
So are you saying sort of that path too? There's no there's no sort of base everyone gets even if you qualify. We've got to be fully
Right.
focused on the strategic.
Yeah, absolutely. Otherwise, we're squandering our treasure.
When you look at the projects that have come in just in my short time
Yeah,
here, all of them are over 100 million.
that's right.
Now, when you talk about, I think we're on that seesaw. In other words, how much award has to be there to incentivize the community to take on the debt load, right? And so we've seen it in Woodstock, a $99 million project voted down, absent state award. How much state award would have make the voting public say, yes, it's worth it. So if we did a base of 20%, we would have to have had a minimum of 20 million, and we're doing one project. So all the other projects that are in the queue, they're getting 5 extra points every year that were delayed. It really means that the scope of scale of money we're talking about, you're doing one major project a year. So if we dilute the award, which we have to because of the fiscal reach constraints we're dealing with, it's a program that's almost not incentivizing investment by the communities because it's just not the.
But can I ask a follow, like in that example, and perhaps this is too real to assess in live, but
Maybe we go, yeah.
well, I don't know that the geography there well enough. Like, is there a world in which that project perhaps could be more regionalized
Regional project?
than it is?
Yeah.
Oh.
And in that case, again, I probably speaking too openly, but I think we're at the point we have to. I think we have to have these hard conversations.
So what's a regional part?
So, well, it is regional,
Woodstock
have a beautiful plan for a new school. And it would, for a lot of facilities reasons, be a good investment. Is it the best investment for the region?
Yeah.
Is there a configuration that could or should be different in that? And I'm
Well,
fully I'm speaking from Williston CVSD, so that's not my community, and I realize I'm probably
So-
walking on fragile
is this
ground.
code word for consolidation?
Yes.
Okay,
But it's,
let's just talk openly.
That's what I think.
Regional, okay.
Yeah.
can I suggest an approach?
Yeah.
Okay, so I actually take your point about the prioritization and what I'm wondering, and this is a frank conversation, I think, is what if we started from what we would like to see and then reverse engineer to how do we incentivize
You have
schools
to.
to do that? So for example,
Yeah.
I think what you were pointing to, and I'll say it because I've said it to them and I've said it to other high school areas as well, is can and should folks looking at these big high schools really be looking at a regional comprehensive high school model, which may work better in some areas and not in all, right? Rutland is actually a great example. There's a lot of high schools in that area. Could they have a
Sports teams.
comprehensive high school with a CTE on campus and invest in that building and have something fabulous? I've said it here in central Vermont as well. I've set it up in the North Country area. I've said it to the Woodstock folks. When we're looking at building $100 million building for 600 students, should we be asking, have you actually talked to your neighbors? And I will tell you that there are some areas that are really looking to do this, and they call me and they say, how do we do a regional comprehensive high school? You know, how do we, and I'll say, like, have you talked to your neighbors? And the answer is no, because those governance boundaries that exist become walls, literally, to this kind of thinking. So a way that we can begin to support regional thinking is by incentivizing that really clearly through this kind of program.
Incentivizing it and then making sure we allow structures or whatever we
Yes.
need so that
they can do it.
they can do it, and, you know, in terms of the governance.
Yeah.
piece.
And I definitely hear the sports team thing all the time, and I don't know that that's the work that we need to consider here.
It's what
Different
will
role.
make decisions locally.
I mean, those
That's
are adults.
locally, they're gonna make a decision. They're not gonna consolidate with a high school down the road 10 miles if they're sports rivals.
But we are,
That's the reality that's gonna happen on the local level. The local level is the one that's gonna have to consolidate.
but are
And the
we,
transportation costs and time of students being on a bus.
but are we the state, you know, the statewide eyes on the whole forest, not just on some trees? And so we've got to set some different incentives, boundary, minimums and directions that further carrots and sticks on local decision-making.
But it's gonna be the locals that are gonna make that
They're gonna have
decision, no
different
matter how much we may say you should be consolidating, because you've got 3 high schools within a 20-mile radius.
But then we can also say that's a local choice. The state is not going to award money to that.
They will definitely have different decisions. We are discussing here, without a doubt.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I ask, please, it's gotta come up at some point, but what's gonna happen in geographic areas where you've got independent schools and public schools, and how are they going to interplay with each other? But we didn't, I mean, we haven't, that didn't show up in any of these slides, and it is a reality that we're gonna have to
Well,
grow.
the other piece too, along the Connecticut River, you've got a couple school districts at the Vermont
State.
districts over in New Hampshire.
Mhm.
Gotta
So are you
figure that.
asking whether or not we would have awards for independent schools?
I'm not even getting that granular. It's
Are you
bigger
asking-
than that?
Yeah.
How would, if we're talking about sort of regional decisions and quote unquote consolidation, what does that look like in a geographic area that has
Yeah.
a public high school and an independent high school? And so, any thoughts or?
I think it is bigger. I mean, I think it's a bigger conversation, right? And I actually think this is a place where we could probably use our partners over in the Ed Commission to think through some of that. Because it gets to the entire educational landscape and how we deliver education. So I would say I wouldn't be prepared on the fly to respond to it. I would want to dig into it more. Getting understanding.
Well, it's real.
Can we maybe with the 8 minutes or so we have left before we switch to excess spending, if we're thinking from that reverse engineering.
Yeah.
Like just all sort of put our, you know, frank in the moment thoughts out there about what the biggest. From what we've learned so far, from the work of the previous commission, from what they've presented, like if we're reverse engineering, what are the most important strategic, whatever we're gonna call them, strategic points, strategic incentives that we're building a program towards? You've given us.
Academic excellence.
Can you go back, can you flip us back to the bonus incentive slide? Let's.
And if you go
Wow,
to
public
page
safety.
8, it's got the.
Yeah,
Towards the very end.
Senator Weeks.
what I see missing from this conversation, both in prioritization and in incentives, is academic excellence. We're really talking about all facilities, but the goal has got to be that we're providing an academic environment for our students that's,
Anything.
near the top of the nation. And facilities is a tool to deliver, not the end goal. The end goal is the academics. And I'm not sure how to quantify that, whether it's in prioritization or whether it's
Is it in bonus F?
Yeah.
So major renovation to improve educational alignment and capacity.
Yeah, but I think that's a high priority. That's a priority.
Okay, it becomes a priority and not,
Yeah, it's not an afterthought. It's the goal. That's the strategic goal. If we're not providing academic excellence, then we're not in the right business. Just.
Yes, but
Yes, but.
how does that, I mean,
Yeah.
Educational alignment,
You can
how
have-
do you define that?
fabulous teaching in a
Run down.
crappy building and you can
Right,
have.
so I'm not saying it's 100%, but it's
So I
a,
don't, I'm not sure how we map that exactly here onto this.
oh, I'm not sure either. I didn't come here with that answer.
Yeah.
I'm just, it's a stark absence on what our strategic goal here is as a with a goal, with a look at school construction. What,
For one consolidation feed into that?
maybe, but maybe not. That's part of the question.
Oh.
It's not just about consolidation, but I agree with you. Okay, so some people say that consolidation should be to provide richer academic environment. Okay, good. Another theory is that consolidation cuts costs,
maybe.
and then there's 1,000 naysayers that didn't happen.
Yeah.
So somehow we have to find that balance between, is consolidation like a one-to-one parallel to academic excellence? Not necessarily, but it could be, and it should be. That's, if we're really gonna put consolidation on the table, we have to back it up with the philosophy that it's for the student. It's for the academic excellence, the programs for the student. That's the goal.
Well, I think that's in prioritization considerations, the weighting assigned priorities can be a means to steer projects towards alignment with a long-term vision for education in the state. So I think that's getting towards what you're.
Yeah. So Senator, are you saying that in the prioritization chart, and we still actually, I mean, I think a good. We were building this somewhat from the existing program and from the Rhode Island program, right? Because we wanted a framework to build from. So we do have a prioritization scale that allows you to objectively evaluate programs like projects that are put in front of you, right? So are you suggesting that something like expanded or aligned, right? What am I gonna say? Educational, Martine, like save me, I can see your.
Doesn't the facilities master plan incorporate ed specs?
Yeah, it should,
And,
yes.
and the facilities master plan is really driving where we're going educationally.
Yeah.
What we envision the needs are for the SUSD.
Yeah.
So I believe that is somewhat addressing that issue.
But do we have a factor that,
I mean, we had it here in the bonus.
Can we not assume that educational excellence is the North Star for our education system? Is that not a given? It is for me. I don't know, I don't see why we have to reflect it in our prioritization.
but how do we facilitate it? That's the
But
question.
that's, I don't know, I guess I just see that as not what we're doing right now.
Does a building facilitate it? Or does the faculty and programming?
Well, I think we're also here because there's a reality, because there's both. Like at a certain point, if your building can't open because there's mold, if you've got fans running that are louder than the mower we were annoyed by this morning, like, is that materially improving some academic thing? Maybe, maybe not, but that's just the day-to-day. I guess I think I take it like, we need schools. We learned from COVID, we physically need schools. We need kids in them. And right now, we know our schools are in really tough shape, and we know we have some big strategic systemic challenges in our state in terms of the whole school system. So I guess I'm getting a little lost on how we get to, like, it does seem like we're all on the same. Everything in schools is related to academic excellence, but there's a lot of factors to that. the exact like delivery of education doesn't feel like the purview of this
Right.
working group. And so I worry about us getting a little off track, but
I don't want to get off track,
Yeah.
but I'll highlight, thank Jill for pointing this out. So in the bonus section, there's major renovations to improve educational alignment and capacity. That's not a bonus. That's a priority. I mean, that really belongs under the heart of the priority. That's my only point. It's not a collateral thought. It's not an afterthought. It's the goal. That's all. That's my only point.
Okay.
So perhaps it's a higher.
So that's your point.
It's a priority. It's not a bonus.
Yeah.
Okay, great. We are basically out of time on this particular area. Framework.
2-minute break. Give folks a 2-minute
Sure,
break.
we'll have
so
a
we can run to the
2-minute break,
bathroom
and then
and
we'll come back and talk about excess spending.
But hold all these thoughts, because this is the hard stuff
Thank
we're getting
you
into today.
so much,
Yes.
Bob and Jill. That was really
And-
wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the afternoon, we're getting back into this same conversation.
Mhm.
Yeah, are we off?